Hi guys, I would like to welcome you back to our channel Vision Desk. Today, the topic that I have chosen for this video is of particular interest to me, and the topic is air warfare in the 20th century. The 20th century, to me, didn't just change the ways wars were fought, it flipped the entire rule book. At the beginning of the 19th, the idea of flying wasn't much more than a dream shared by inventors and a few daredevils willing to risk their lives. At that time, planes were no more than cloths and contraptions. Soldiers still fought mostly on the ground and at sea, and the sky was simply the place where weather happened. Nothing more than that. But as the decades rolled, something incredible happens. Those flimsy planes turned into sleek machines of steel and fire. By the end of the century, jets fighters could cross the continents in the time it takes to watch a movie. That's how fast it got. Bombers could deliver enough powers to entire cities, and satellites could guide a missile to a single building from thousands of miles away. Air power didn't just add another layer to warfare. It redefined speed, reach, and destructions in ways humanity had never seen. In this video, we're going to see the time frame between different parts of 20th century, from the early days to World War I to World War II and the Vietnam era, and after that the 1980s and 200s. So stick with us. I would like to ask you, if you enjoy this video, please make sure subscribe and click the notification bell to get the updates as soon as the videos are uploaded. So let's get on with the topic. Now let's start with the early days. When the Wright brothers proved that powered flight was possible, most people saw it just as a marvel, maybe even a few forms of transport. Militaries, however, saw it as a different way, an entirely new vantage point over the battlefield. In the early years of World War I, planes were unarmed and used purely for reconnaissance, flying over enemy lines to spot troop movement. But it didn't take long before pilots started taking pistols and rifles up with them, firing at each other during the flight. Soon, engineers began mounting machine guns directly onto planes. The first example of it was the Fokker and Decker. It introduced synchronized firing, so bullets could pass through the spinning propeller without destroying it. And at that moment, dogfights were born. After that, bombers like the Gautha GV appeared, dropping explosives far behind the front lines, sometimes on cities. By 1918, the war in the air had evolved from risky observation flights to a brutal, fast-moving third dimension of combat that commanders could no longer ignore. Now we move on to most people's favorite topic, World War II, as I like to call it, the age of air dominance. So by the time World War II began, the shift of air dominance was completely changed. The warplanes were no longer just a tool of war. It was a centerpiece of strategy. Fighters like the British Spitfire and the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the American P-51 Mustang turned the skies into battlegrounds where survival often came down to skill, speed, and seconds. Massive bombers such as the B-17 and the B-25 and the British Lancaster could carry thousands of pounds of bomb, leveling entire industrial districts in a single mission. And then there was the B-29 Superfortress, which would change history forever, delivering the first nuclear strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some moments prove just how critical air power had begun. 1940, Battle of Britain. The Royal Air Force stopped Hitler's massive invasion without a single ground battle on the British soil, purely by winning the skies. In 1941, the Japanese plane struck Pearl Harbor, sinking and crippling the US fleet in under 2 hours. And in 1945, as I said, B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, followed days later by another on Nagasaki, ending the war in the Pacific, but ushering in a terrifying new age where the skies could deliver unimaginable destruction. The World War II, as I think, made it clear control of the air often meant control of the war. Now let's start discussing the jet age and the Cold War. When the war ended, the propeller era was already fading. Jet engines introduced in the closing month of World War II turned aircraft into supersonic machines. F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15 became icon of the Cold War, clashing in high-speed duels that made dogfight in the World War II look slow. But Cold War shifted the stakes. Now bombers like the B-52 Stratofortress and the Soviet Tu-95 Bear weren't just carrying conventional bombs, they were carrying nuclear capable weapons that could destroy cities in a single strike. These planes became tools of deterrence, constantly on high alert in case the other side made the first move. Missiles began to challenge bombers with surface to air defense like the Soviet SA-2, making high altitude bombing far more dangerous. During the Vietnam War, the US air powers faced guerrilla fighters who couldn't be beaten with bombing alone, but helicopters and close air support became vital in supporting troops on the ground. And then came stealth. The late Cold War saw the debut of the F-117 Nighthawk, a strange angular aircraft that could slip past radars like a ghost using stealth technology. Suddenly, the race was just for speed or firepower, it was for invisibility. Now at last, we will discuss the probably the most important, the late 20th century, as I like to call it, the era of precision and multi-role aircrafts. By the 90s, 80s and 60s, the battlefield in the air had changed again. It was no longer about dropping as many bombs as possible, it was about hitting exactly the right target. For example, laser guided bombs and GPS guided missiles meant a pilot could strike a single building without leveling the entire neighborhood. The Gulf War in the 91 was the clearest demonstration yet. Coalition aircraft systematically destroyed Iraqi air defenses, command centers and supply lines before ground war even began. In just weeks, aircrafts or airstrikes crippled Saddam Hussein's forces, providing the precision could be as decisive as sheer firepower. By the end of the century, fighters like the F-15 Eagle, Russians Su-27 Flanker and the Eurofighter Typhoon could do it all, win dogfights, hit ground targets and even gather reconnaissance all in a single mission. They were like the do-it-all planes. Air forces no longer needed separate planes for separate jobs. One aircraft could dominate the field in multiple ways. As we see now, the air warfare is completely changing. Now the 5th gen fighters like the F-35 and the Chinese J-20 Su-57, they are the next generation of air warfare, putting in stealth first and maneuverability second. It is completely changing again and again, and we could hope for the best.